Everybody good? Great. Are y'all ready to leave here with all your problems solved and still not really know what you're doing? Was anyone embarrassed to come to this talk because you thought it would be an admittance that you don't really know what you're doing? I may have overpromised with this title, but we're going to do our best. Hey, I'm Marlena Bowen. I work at Root Car Insurance Company. It's a venture capital-backed startup in Columbus. Our whole product is a mobile app. We sell car insurance based on telematics data. It runs on Rails, and the front end is written in React Native. This is a picture of me back when I had bangs and back when we had a dedicated Android team. That was pre-React Native. But we are going to talk about how to approach problems in software development. So we're not really going to solve all your problems today, just some software-related ones. And we're going to focus on approach because your approach to solving problems is your key to success. So who cares? Okay, why are you here? Why am I here? The real question is who should care, and the answer is, of course, everyone. This is relevant to beginners. It's relevant to tech leads who maybe have the curse of knowledge and are having difficulty empathizing with juniors on their team who might have a little less experience with problem solving. And it's relevant to anybody who occasionally has an off day, because we don't always do everything exactly right every day, right? So why problem solving? Why should we care about our approach to solving problems in software development? You guys ever do that thing where you're getting a compiler error and instead of trying to fix it, you're just sitting there rerunning it? It must be the machine, it's certainly not me. Or when you have a problem, you just start hacking random things. You're like, this might work, that might work, without really thinking it through. And you end up wasting a half a day just doing random stuff. We should care about how we approach problems because it's more efficient. And we want to do things right? We want to really solve our problems. We don't want to waste time. So, the way I tell it, there are 4 primary steps to problem solving. First, we have to understand the problem that we're trying to solve. And I know you're probably thinking, wait a minute, I thought I could solve my problems without really knowing what I'm doing. I'll touch on that in a minute. We do have to understand the problem, even if we feel like we don't really know what we're doing. And then once we understand the problem, we can start planning a solution. Then we can execute on it, and then we can check our work. So we're going to focus primarily on step 1, because I believe that understanding is the most important step, especially if you feel like you don't really know what you're doing. So we're going to spend a lot of time there, and then I'm going to go through an example problem to kind of give a highlight of how the rest of the process works. So let's start with understanding. And by the way, I'll apologize, I have kind of a sinus infection. I don't normally sound this nasally, but I'm doing the best I can, okay? I want to say, and you've probably heard this before, you have to go slow in order to go fast. I hear this a lot in software, but this is not a new concept. Augustus, that guy who founded the Roman Empire, said it sort of. He said festina lente, and forgive my Latin. But that means make haste slowly. So this is a really old idea. It's applicable to a lot of things, but especially in software. You have to take your time to really understand what you're doing. When you're doing that thing where you're just hacking your way through solving a problem, you end up being inefficient about it and possibly introducing more bugs by not taking the time to really understand the problem before you start solving it. And that takes time, but I really think it's worth the investment to understand the problem before you try to solve it. So, like I kind of said earlier, not really knowing what you're doing is not the same thing as not understanding the problem. Okay, you have to understand a problem in order to solve it successfully. So what do I mean by not really knowing what you're doing? I'm talking about a couple of things. Maybe you feel like you don't really know what you're doing because you're suffering from imposter syndrome. I'm sure this is familiar to a lot of people, even if you don't deal with this personally, I'm sure you've probably heard of it, but in case you haven't, I'm going to talk about it anyway. It's also known as fraud syndrome, and according to Psychology Today, the long and short of it is that people with imposter phenomenon feel like they aren't really worthy of their accomplishments. They attribute everything to luck instead of skill. If that sounds familiar, it's not uncommon in our industry. I experience this a lot. I find myself saying imposter syndrome things even in conversation and saying I'm just really lucky, or something stupid that totally discredits my credibility as a software engineer. But this gets in my way a lot when I'm approaching a problem, because sometimes I'll come upon a problem that seems really hard and I think I don't really know what I'm doing, I can't solve that. If you're dealing with this, or if maybe someone on your team is dealing with this, I find, and I'm not a psychologist, but I find the best way to deal with it is to just recognize it and think of course I know what I'm doing. I am a software engineer. I can solve this problem, because attitude is everything. When we're getting started and we're approaching a problem, you've got to have the right attitude about it. Maybe you don't suffer from imposter syndrome, but you feel like you don't really know what you're doing because you're unfamiliar with the problem. Maybe there's a bug in some code that you have never touched, okay? Or it's with some technology that you've never worked with before. But I feel like that's really exciting, isn't it? Like, I became a software engineer because I wanted to do new stuff, you know? I don't want to do the same thing all the time. But I catch myself approaching problems like, I don't know anything about that. Like, I don't want to have to do that. So I think it's important to work on that and maintain a good attitude of excitement, you know? I think that's the heart of software engineering. So when you're starting out approaching a problem, try to be optimistic about it. You know, try to be excited. Like, what a great opportunity. I can't wait to learn new things. Okay, so where do we start when we're trying to understand a problem? Of course, there's the obvious, you know, you could Google it. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about this because I'm sure a lot of people are very good at using the internet. But I will remind you, you know, a little later on I'm going to talk about how to ask good questions. And I want to preface that part of the talk with, like, Google it first, you know. If you're not used to using resources like Stack Overflow, there are a lot of tips for how to do that, like etiquette for using Stack Overflow that you can look up on your own time. And I'll remind you, you know, GitHub's a good resource too. Like, let's say that I'm using a third-party library and I'm having some issue with it. Like, there's an issues page on GitHub, and I can go there and participate in a forum. But I'll remind you that the feedback loop is slow on online forums, so if you're trying to solve a problem by getting information from other people on the internet in the community, just remember to include good context about your problem, because if you're like, I'm having this really nondescript problem, the response you're going to get is like, well, can you give me some more context or a stack trace or something? Also, you know, docs exist. So before you go running to your coworker, like, I'm having this problem with one of my jar files, like I'm getting a Java compiler error, like, maybe just read some documentation before you do that. Friendly reminder. If you're looking for examples when you're working on an existing project, there's a couple of ways to do that. If you're not using Git grep, like on a daily basis in software development, if you get one thing out of this talk, please write that down. Like, Git grep is my favorite. It is so useful. Or whatever source control tool you're using, look up the equivalent of that, familiarize yourself with it, and start using Git grep to find your way around. When I'm working on adding a feature to an existing project, and I don't know a lot about how that feature is plugged into the project, I just Git grep my way around. It's basically like a search tool inside of a project. So if I'm adding a new feature and I know something similar exists, I can just search around for that. But we want to avoid just copying and pasting, right? And this is relevant when you're doing a search too. If you find some code online, like, oh, I'm having this bug, and then someone on Stack Overflow says, oh, put this code in your Gradle file, or whatever. Before you just go pasting stuff into your project, please make sure you understand why that works, or what that code is doing, because when you just paste things in, you end up with bugs, right? So I find it helpful to map things out when working on an existing project and finding an example that's similar to whatever problem I have to solve. Because when we're solving problems, we want to ask ourselves, like, can I think of a similar problem that's already been solved? You know, so you're looking for examples. And when I say map things out, I apologize in advance for this graphic. I know you can't really read this content here probably, but I just wanted to give you a basic visual of what I mean. This is what I do. I take a greasy piece of paper out of my desk, and I just literally map things out and draw arrows to connect different things so that I understand how a feature is connected throughout the project. I think this is a really helpful practice if you're not doing this, but I think this was one from like the first time I had to work on a Rails project, and I didn't know a lot about Rails and like services and domain pub sub and how jobs work, so I just mapped it out, and this is really helpful. But this can uncover some things, like I think I probably highlighted, you know, some questions I had. I got to a point where I felt like I'd done a lot of research, but I still had questions. So I found some code that I was working on, and I want to know who worked on it last. So I was saying, who's the best person to ask about this? Where can I get some context? So I used, you know, git blame, not to blame anyone for anything bad, but just to find out who had last touched that file. So maybe like I'm working on a file and I see that Bob worked on it like 3 weeks ago. So I go to Bob and I'm like, hey Bob, you remember when you worked on this feature? And Bob's like, dude, I've written like 1,000 lines of code in the past 3 weeks. I don't remember that at all. You can ask people questions, but I just want you to know that you cannot rely on them. You can learn a lot from other people, but I don't want you to overestimate them. Because people tend not to, especially software engineers. I don't know why that is. We just don't remember the things that we've worked on. You also want to remember that people's time is valuable, you know? So if you aren't familiar with the concept of rubber ducking, when you verbalize a problem that you're having, when you state things aloud, like if I'm going to go to somebody and I'm going to explain the problem to them because I want them to help me solve it, I'm likely to give more context that I may have taken for granted when I was just thinking it through on my own. So before I actually go and take up somebody's time asking them a question, I want to verbalize it because I might gain some insight and save myself from going and embarrassing myself in front of that person or taking up their time answering a question that I could have answered on my own if I just spent a little more time thinking it through. I also use Git blame to find PRs for relevant feature work. And this is relevant when you're working on an existing project, like I need to work on a feature that already exists, or I'm adding a feature that's similar to something someone else has done. I'll find that PR so that I can look at the whole big picture of like, I'm adding this feature and Jimmy did something really similar to that, and I can see that he wrote these tests and he touched all of these files, so I know.
What's what PR?
Like a peer review, a pull request on GitHub. This talk kind of assumes that you're using something similar to GitHub and that your workflow is like you open a pull request before just merging your code right into master. So the other people on your team have to review it. And that's it. I think that's really useful in source control. These are good resources. Like if I find a line of code on GitHub that I'm confused about, I can, through GitHub, find that whole PR and see everything that person did when they wrote that line of code. And then I can map that out, and that might help me get a better understanding of what else is related to that. Does that answer your question? Okay. Debugging is really helpful when trying to understand a problem. Debugging is incredibly valuable, and I feel like I could do an entire talk on debugging best practices, but I don't have time for that. So I'm just going to go over the highlights. Debugging is really useful when you think something is going on or when you have an expectation for what the program is doing, but you need to verify what's actually happening. I find that, and maybe this is just like a personal, maybe I'm just projecting, but I think juniors, myself included, tend to lack concrete debugging skills. So if you have somebody on your team who's coming to you a lot and asking you questions and you're like, dude, can you just debug it, you know? Like, teach that person how to use whatever debugger is most relevant for your tech stack. Befriend the debugger. If you're not sure what the best debugger is for you, I'm sure other people on the internet know, or someone on your team can tell you and help you use that. There's a lot of fancy debugging tools out there, but I personally use a lot of print statements because I find that helps me make my feedback loop much shorter, and I think that that's really important in debugging. It's just to make the feedback loop as short as possible. I don't want to spend a bunch of time going through things when I can just get the input that I need as quickly as possible. Okay, let's go over an example problem. Now there's a lot of problems in software development. Maybe I should have said this earlier. By problem, I mean I could mean anything. Like, the first thing I think of is a bug, right? Like, I got a problem, it's this bug. But sometimes I say that I'm solving a problem when I'm referring to just new feature work. Like, anything I'm doing in software is a problem to be solved. I'm going to talk to you about a bug. And it's a pretty small example for the sake of time, and it's not meant to be technical. I'm not here to teach you React Native, so I'm just going to go over it at a high level. But if there's anything that's confusing, please interrupt me, and I'm happy to, like, get into the specifics if it's preventing anybody from like getting the overall context. Okay, this is the policy start date screen in my app. When somebody's buying a car insurance policy, they can pick the start date for their policy. They have two options. They either pick today or they pick a future date. When they select choose a future date, this date picker pops up right here and lets them select a specific date. Like, let's say January 20th. So the bug here, there's a couple bugs on this screen. It's an old screen. The problem that we're dealing with is that when we pick choose a future date, and then we select a specific date through that date picker, if we change our minds and we go back and reselect today, the app still saves that date that we picked in the date picker as our start date. This is a big problem. This has a lot of business implications, like, you know, I could be selling people car insurance policies that start on a date that they didn't really want. But this screen's old. It used to be in Swift, and we rewrote it in React Native. It's one of the first screens we rewrote in React Native, so we didn't really know what we were doing when we wrote it. I have not been working on the client very much lately, so my React Native skills are really rusty, and I've never looked at the code for this screen before, so I don't really know what I'm doing when it comes to this screen. But first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find it. So I'm going to use git grep to just search for that title, like the screen says, choose a start date. So I'm going to search for that, and it's in the quote start date screen, so I'm going to use my text editor to open it up. Now, since my React Native skills are kind of rusty, I Googled React Native. And the first thing I found was this Facebook getting started, like learn the basics documentation. And like within the first 2 pages of that, I remembered that React Native components have a render method. And that's where the magic happens. That's where a component gets rendered. So I go into this file and I search for that. I start there. And looks like I've got some logic for it loading. That seems good. And then I've got this navigation view. It says choose a start date. Okay, so I can see that. Then I've got this scroll view. Looks like there's a radio group with 2 radio labels. One says today and one says choose a future date. So that must mean this is a radio group and these are both radio labels. Okay. Then there's some method down here, render start date. I don't know what that does. Other highlights look like the radio group has a selected value, and when you change it, it looks like it calls a handle change method. So I'm going to map this out. Okay, radio group, we've got today, or we've got the future. It holds on to a selected value, and it calls a handle change method. And then under this radio group, we've got this render start date method that's getting called. So I'm kind of piecing things together, but I want to know what these methods do. So I search for handle change, and it looks like it takes a new value, and if the new value is today, it's doing some kind of mixed panel API tracking thing. I know that's something my marketing team uses. I'm not really concerned about that. But it looks like it sets the state up here of selected value to the new value. Okay. So handle change just sets the selected value. That seems simple enough. Oh, and then there's the render start date method. And that says if selected value is not future, don't do anything. But if it is future, it's going to render this date input cell, which looks like it takes a start date, holds on to the start date, and calls this handle date change method. And it looks like handle date change sets the state of start date. Okay, so I'm still mapping things out. I've got this radio group. It calls a handle change method, and that sets my selected value. And then I've got this date input cell, and that calls the handle date change method and sets the start date. Everybody with me there? Okay? All right, so I think I see the problem here. I think I understand this problem. And I'm going to prove it to myself by stating the problem in plain English. Because if I can't articulate it in plain language, then I don't know what the problem is. It seems to me that when selecting the today radio label, it doesn't set the start date to today's date. That start date's only getting set through the date picker, which is only visible when the selected value is the future. So I know what my problem is, and now I can plan a solution. There's more than one way to solve a problem, of course, and this is relevant in step 4 as well when we check our solution. But for now, we're just going to think through our solution before we execute on it and ask ourselves what could go wrong. So I like to start by asking myself how well this feature is tested. Like, how did this bug even happen? How did we get here? So I'm going to find the relevant test, and I'm going to see that there's no test for this behavior. So I'm going to write one. So I'm going to write a test that when the selected value is future, and the start date is a future date, but then selected value is set to today, start date should be today's date. So I'm going to write that test. I'm going to run it, and I'm going to watch it fail. And it should fail because the app is not behaving that way. Then, I'm going to ask myself what the simplest thing I can do to solve this problem is. Because I don't have any big ideas right now, and I just want to get this test to pass. So, if the problem is that selecting the today radio label doesn't set start date to today's date, then the simplest solution I can think of is to set start date to today's date when the today radio label is selected. So, again, this handle change method, that's what happens when we mess with this radio group and we pick a radio label. This is the method that gets called. And it's setting the state of selected value. So maybe, what I'm thinking, simplest thing I can do to get this test to pass is in here, when the new value is today, I'm going to set the state of start date to today's date. Right here. Yeah?
Why not set up the default value for today?
So, I will touch on that in a second. That's actually default value. Can you hold that thought? It's definitely going to be relevant. And like I said, there's a lot of ways to solve this problem. This was just the first thing that I thought of, so it's the first thing I tried. It's probably not the best solution, but we're not there yet. So I'm going to write this out in pseudocode before I actually execute on it, because I'm just really trying to think it through. So when the radio group's handle change method is called, if the today radio label was selected, then I'm going to set start date to today's date. Now I've got my plan, and I can execute on it. And maybe, maybe during the course of step 2, I thought of a lot of better solutions. I'm not going to get into those because, like I said, I'm not here to teach you React Native. But at a high level, we're going to take that and we're going to run with it. And if you've done steps 1 and 2 right, step 3 should be the shortest step you have. Not that we want to rush it. We have to go slow in order to go fast. But if we've planned everything out, solving the actual problem should be pretty easy, right? So the solution we're going with, we're throwing this set state method here inside of handle change. We're going to set start date to today's date, whenever the selected value is today. So we're just going to try that, and we're going to run that test we wrote and see if it passes. If it passes, then we can be pretty confident that we do indeed understand this problem, but if it fails, we're back at step 1, because obviously we're missing something. When you are executing on your solution, yeah?
When you write your test, do you just kind of write down in your hand on a board or something like that instead of just executing it somewhere else, or?
No, I would really like this. So since this is an existing feature, I can assume that there's a unit test that is already written for this, and I just add a test case to it. So I'm just going into the existing test file, and I'm adding that test. And since I'm using React Native, I'm using this this test framework called Mocha. It's very similar to RSpec if you've ever worked with that. But basically, it's like you're describing a particular context, and you say it should set start date to today's date when under this condition, and then you just set your expectations for it. I didn't include that code specifically because I don't want to teach you Mocha right now. But does that answer your question?
Yes.
Like I really would write that test.
Okay.
Really would watch it fail, and then make sure that I can make it pass. So when you're executing on your solution, you want to check for unexpected side effects, okay? You want to make sure that other tests aren't failing, and you want to look out for compiler warnings. And if you get through this and you execute on a solution that did get that test to pass, and it doesn't appear that you broke anything, and you can't think of anything better to do right now, then you're on to step 4, and we want to check that solution. So this simple solution technically did solve the problem, but we're going to ask ourselves some questions about it, like, does it make sense? And I realize this is like an abstract and subjective question, and sometimes we feel like, yeah, this makes sense, but then we open up pull requests, and then in the peer review, somebody's like, this doesn't make any sense. It happens. But you want to try to anticipate that PR feedback. You want to ask yourself, like, when I introduce this to my peers, what are they going to say about it? Because you might be able to save yourself some trouble there, or, if you're using GitHub and you're opening up a PR, there's an opportunity for you to add content to your description, and if you're predicting what people are going to say or what kind of questions they're going to have, you can answer those in advance. Yes? Go ahead.
I'll retract my question.
Okay.
All right.
That's okay. You can ask it later if you want. Yeah.
So, like, something that I've done, and this is just to support what you're saying,
days, if you have the time, days later, ask yourself if it makes sense, and go back through and look at it. Because if it looks weird to you and you can't even understand what you fixed, it probably will make sense to somebody else.
Yeah, definitely. If you have time to sit on it, especially if you're not feeling super confident about it, like steps 2, 3, and 4, like planning, executing, and checking are best done in iteration. And if you have the time to just kind of think on it. You ever have that thing happen to you where like a couple days later, or like maybe you're working on a problem, you don't know how to solve it, and you're at dinner with your mom or whatever, and you're like, I've got it, I gotta go, Mom, like I solved the problem, or what have you. Yeah.
Would it help if you put some of the pseudocode in the as a comment?
I mean, I think like adding comments it kind of depends on like what the best practices are, where you work. My project, we don't really add comments. I think we have this philosophy, like the code should be so readable that you don't need comments. So we don't do that, but I know some people really rely on comments, and I think you kind of have to feel it out. If you're working on an existing project and see just what the conventions are as far as comments go. If you find yourself having to write a lot of comments to explain the choices that you made, like in your code, actually adding comments, maybe there's a better way to do it. You know, if it's not that readable or understandable, I think that might be a sign that you should spend a little more time trying to figure out if there's a better solution. Yeah.
What are some questions you ask yourself to answer this question?
Does it make sense? So like I said, I would try to, it's case specific, right? It depends on what kind of code you're writing. But I would definitely think like, what are people gonna say about this? You know, and there's some other questions that are relevant to this too. It's kind of like, you know, all these questions are related to each other. But if you're like, this is really goofy, I don't know why I did this, it probably doesn't make sense. I think actually I have more content in these slides that's going to touch on that too. Oh yeah, I should have just gone to the next slide because it answers your question. I had a momentary lapse in judgment. So for example, I would ask myself, like, you know, is this method really the best place to add this logic? Does it make sense to add the solution here? Do I want handle change to set the start date? Or, you know, is this the best way to handle state in this component? How's the rest of the component handling state? So like I said, the questions relating to does it make sense are kind of specific to the problem, but hopefully that helps. So if I'm asking myself, like, what's the best way to handle state in this component? This kind of answers your question before. Maybe then I'm like, okay, I'm going to Google React Native state because I don't really remember how React Native components handle state. And then I find it pretty much immediately, like, oh yeah, React Native components have constructor methods. And this is where the state is getting set initially. And actually the default value for start date is today. So we've hard-coded it to today. So when the component first renders, if you are on, it's automatically selected today. That's the default. And the start date's today. So the problem with this bug is that if you choose a future date, and then you pick a future date, hitting to today has already reset this default value. We don't go back to this. And it never gets reset, and start date is just held onto by the future date. So anyway, I feel like there's a better way to do it than just hard coding these. Like, what could go wrong here? You know, for example, let's say the next screen in the flow is a review screen. And it shows me the policy options that I've picked. And I picked a particular like deductible level for bodily injury because this is a car insurance app. And I look at that review screen and I'm like, oh wait, I want a higher deductible than that. So I go back past this screen and then I go back to the bodily injury screen and I change that. When I come back to this screen, it will have re-rendered and it will have reset these values. And the app won't remember them and I have to do it again. So that's kind of suboptimal. And that's the kind of stuff you want to think of when you ask yourself what could go wrong. So, you know, now I'm kind of at a point where I think like maybe my solution wasn't the best, and maybe instead of having that handle change method, handle or set start date, there's a better way to do it. I'm also going to ask myself, is this solution reasonable? So by that I mean, does it follow existing conventions in my code base? And this might be like strictly syntax-wise, like, did I do something kind of wacky compared to the way that we're doing things here? Because people don't usually like that, right? Like, when I open up my PR, people are going to be like, well, that's not how we do it. We do it like this, or whatever. That might be unreasonable. Another really important question related to this that you should ask yourself is, does my solution fix the root cause of the problem? Or am I just covering up the symptom? I think especially when we don't take the time to really understand the problem, we have a tendency to just fix the symptom without really knowing that we've actually solved it, right? Like, in my shop, we ship new releases every single week. We have a rapid shipment thing, and sometimes there are bugs, and so we're shipping the app, and we're like, oh, there's this bug, but we really want to get the app out today. We better like hurry up and fix it. But odds are when we do that, and when we're just kind of brushing through it, we're just covering up that symptom, and we're not really getting to the root of the problem, in which case, the solution may not be reasonable. We also want to ask ourselves when we're checking our solution, can we solve it another way? You know, is there a better way? In this case, you know, yes, like just brainstorming, and now here I am back at step 2, planning. Maybe when I hit this continue button, there's a continue method that gets called, and maybe that should take the selected value into consideration, and then set the start date from there. Like, there are probably a lot of different ways that I can solve this problem, and I should evaluate all of those and figure out which one makes the most sense and is the most reasonable. So I'm back at step 2, I'm planning. Maybe I'll try that, make sure my test passes, and then I'll ask myself, does it make sense? Is it reasonable? Is there a better way? And by asking myself those questions, I can, again, kind of like predict this PR feedback loop, and that can help me like explain my decisions when I'm opening my PR. I can add some content to the description, like, I made this choice because of whatever. Or, if I'm still like not totally confident that my solution is the best, I think PRs are also a good place to add questions. Like, I made this choice because of this, but I'm not really sure about this. Does anyone have input for that? And versus like just going to someone and interrupting them to be like, I have this question. When somebody's reviewing your code, they have all the code, they have all the context, they have your description, and they're going to give you a much better answer than if you were just like asking them on the fly. So yeah, that's pretty much it. You can find me on the internet if you want to. I know I kind of gave a spiel about like asking questions and how you should think before you do it, but you can ask me any questions you want. So yeah.
So you mentioned that you switched between a couple technologies before. So what is sort of that drive for switching to different web technologies for you? Is it something that you're interested in, or is it that the technology is getting hotter, it's easier to use for certain?
Yeah, we had, so specifically like our MVP, like our minimum viable product, was written in Swift. We just wanted to spike out this iOS app, like sell some insurance policies on it, prove that it was working, get more funding, et cetera, et cetera. And then it came time like, okay, half the population maybe has an iOS, like an iPhone. What about all the people on Android? We had a really small development team, and we also were having trouble. We're in Columbus, Ohio, and we were having trouble finding Swift developers who had Rails experience. You know, like I feel like we were finding some iOS developers who were strictly iOS, but we were looking for full stack. So we wanted to roll out our Android client without having to rewrite the whole app. We also wanted to use a framework. React Native's in JavaScript, so it's easy to find people with JavaScript experience. So there were a couple things that went into that decision, but it was convenient for us because we don't have 2 apps now. I mean, we have some native code that's specific to each platform, but the whole UI is shared, so that's really convenient. It's also easier to find JavaScript developers than iOS developers who also can code in Rails. So, yeah, we made that decision a while ago, and we didn't really know what we were doing at first. Now we're rewriting the app, so that screen that we just went through is getting ripped out and rewritten, and thank goodness. Because it's one of those things, like you start working with a new language, you're like, okay, I get it, I'm getting it, I got the hang of it, and then a couple months later after you've been working with it, you go back and you're like, what idiot wrote this? But of course it was you know, probably. Not me on that screen in that case, but I'm sure I've written some bad React Native in my existing app that's now getting rewritten. But I mean, like in my shop, we're not, you know, if it's not broke, don't fix it. You know, we're not gonna like move from Rails to Elixir or something just because, you know, like we spent a lot of time making the decision, and because it helped us roll out our Android client and grow the team more quickly, it was a good choice for us.
What's been your biggest struggle with like juniors catching them up to speed?
Dude, we have pretty much only hired senior software engineers because we're a small team, right? Like we have 30 engineers now. When I started, I was the 6th engineer. So we're just getting to a point where we're onboarding engineers. And so, I mean, I think like trying to enable people to solve their own problems is really helpful. But of course, I encounter senior engineers who still don't do a lot of this stuff. Like, don't Google it before they go asking about, whatever. But yeah, it's definitely a work in progress for my team for sure. We've like just started hiring juniors.
Yeah, it's a struggle.
It is.
Yeah, and we hire like temp work, and it's hard even with them too. And they should. There some are seniors, and we've run into similar issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think like definitely teaching people how to answer their own questions because it's time consuming, right? To mentor people and to onboard juniors, and that's kind of the trade-off. Like, you can't only hire senior software engineers. There are not enough. You have to hire junior talent. You have to train them on your project, but you don't want to spend all of your time teaching people. You're not a university, So I think just like giving people the tools to go through these steps, like giving people enough time to, especially I think that's really helpful with juniors actually, like don't rush them through their work. Let them take the time to understand things. Make sure that they're adding good commentary in their PRs, asking questions in their PRs, that kind of thing. But yeah, it's a work in progress. Yeah.
I have a question on the check step for number 4, I guess. So when it comes to pull requests, if you guys have arrived, you guys are at step 4, and you ask a question, and I'm asking my boss, for instance, like, does this make sense? If you guys started from a different understanding, like, how do you converge, and how do you, if you guys are really butting heads on something, how do you, like, handle that in a PR? When does it escalate to, like, a meeting or something?
Yeah, we have this label on our PRs called discussion, and so if you can see that coming, then you put the discussion label on it, and you make sure you leave your PR open for a couple of days, right, so people have the opportunity. I feel like sometimes it just comes down to hierarchy, unfortunately. Like, sometimes you gotta do what your boss is telling you to do, right? But I think, like, in the experience of my team, we've definitely learned how to, like, communicate kindly to one another and to not escalate things or be like, I'm right and you're an idiot, and I think it's all about compromise. Like, if you really, I don't know, I think we get really opinionated as software engineers, right? And sometimes I'm like, dude, I definitely know the best way to do it and you are wrong, but sometimes it's not worth it, Sometimes, like, it's okay to do something even if you think it's not the most optimal solution, because, like, for the sake of just agreeing on a convention for your team, you gotta go for it. But
I guess follow-up is that, I guess I feel like that too sometimes. I'm like, I guess, like, yeah, that makes sense too. How do you make sure that you don't fall back into, like, imposter syndrome if that keeps happening? Like, I feel like sometimes that happens to me, and I'm like, okay, that wasn't a discussion that, like, I didn't understand, or like, you know what I mean? Or,
yeah, that's a really good question, and I wish I, like, right off the bat had, like, a empowering answer for you, but I feel like, imposter syndrome is an internal struggle, right? Like, obviously as human beings we rely on external feedback to develop ideas about ourselves, our status, and how we're doing, but, like, you really gotta push through it and just, like, know that even if you're not the best software engineer, like, it's constantly a work in progress. Like, you're trying to get better, you're trying to learn, and, like, take it with a grain of salt if you can. Hang in there. You're doing great. Yeah.
No, I had a suggestion for that.
Oh, go ahead.
It's because it sounds kind of stupid, but basically one thing that might help is listing all the things that you have accomplished and, like, goals that you set for yourself, and then maybe saying, well, these are the goals I'm going to accomplish that would make me better, so there's no imposter, so it's one of those find them out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely don't forget about all those things you've accomplished. All the times you were right? I hate that. I feel every time, actually I still struggle with this, when I'm giving someone PR feedback, I always feel like a jerk. Even though I love PR feedback, like, I love it when people realize things I didn't realize. Like, I try not to internalize it when people are like, this is just wrong, or like, oh, you should try doing it like this. I try to be like, yes, I'm learning, or sometimes I'm like, no, you're wrong. But then I take that, I'm like, okay, this guy that I really respect, who's been in the industry for 10 years, is, like, wrong about this. Like, I'm doing okay. Like, like, I'm gonna be great, Maybe that's, like, kind of rude of me, but I really do. I'm like, ooh, that guy doesn't really know what he's doing, and I don't either, and I'm gonna be fine. But yeah. Yeah.
noticed that, so you mentioned some useful commands like git grep and a couple others. So do you prefer to use sort of like these command line tools or something that's more graphical source tree versus command line?
Like instead of using the GitHub UI or whatever?
Yeah.
Yeah, so here's the thing about that. I work with some bullies who've taught me a lot, but like for some reason when I started in my shop, there's 6 of us, right? And there's this one guy, he's a team lead, and he was like really mean about UIs. And to this day, I don't know why. Like I really don't know why he doesn't like them. I'll tell you the GitHub UI did some weird stuff with like my secret keys. It did something weird, I don't know what it was. I didn't understand that problem, I didn't take my time to figure it out. But yeah, I've just become a person who uses the command line for everything, and I can't really justify that to you. It's just kind of the way we do things in my shop. I feel like probably a lot of people do things a particular way just because that's how you do it at your company, but
because you have a mean boss. You just said it.
yeah, he wasn't my boss, but he's actually a really nice guy, just very opinionated, and he was bullying someone else, and so I learned early on, like, I better not use that UI tool. But then the other guy convinced me to do it because he wanted more people on his team, but then it screwed up my secret key, and I was like, Mike was right. But yeah, I use the command line for everything. I guess it's just your preference. I don't feel like you're less of a software engineer because you use UIs. Like, cool software engineers built beautiful UIs that make our lives easier, and I'm just like that jerk who's still using Vim to do all my development because I hate myself. I don't know. Yeah.
So I'm kind of in the junior realm coming into the field. So when it comes to that senior looking down at the junior trying to solve a problem, do you think it's more so they're not doing the abstract coding problems, outside of just specifically fixing problems inside of an application? So like you have Code Wars or Code Price or something that just takes you outside of an IDE and just fix it out. Do you feel like it's a lack of doing that, outside of work?
Do you mean like, is that why juniors struggle, or do you? Yeah. It's hard to say. I think doing things like katas or exercises helps reinforce like the fundamentals of programming, right? And sure, like that can be a lack of experience thing. Like, if I hire somebody who's getting a master's degree from a really great like accredited university but has never worked like on a software project before, that person is still going to struggle even though they have like all this theoretical knowledge. And that could be solved by just writing more code. I think everybody says just write more code, right? Even if you're writing bad code, you'll figure it out. Like, just write code every day. I think I've learned a lot from just copying other people's projects, and like sometimes I'll like clone something and start deleting things until it doesn't work anymore, and then that way I can figure out like, oh, that was important for this reason. Like, but yeah, it's hard when you're a junior and you're already working like 50 hours a week, but to get better you just have to be at home like doing all that stuff, just writing like infinite amounts of code. But if you want to level up, that's what you gotta do. Yeah. Oh, I'm gonna take one in the back. So many questions. I love this.
It's not really a question. It's more of like what's helping you learn what you need or it's like copying like a sort of project or something. And if you use an IDE or any kind of cool debugging tool, like run your tests with step through it, see how it works.
Yeah, as long as things are well tested, that works. I feel like I always start there, especially when I'm working on a feature in an existing project. I'm like, I don't know how this works, I'm going to read these unit tests, but like, so I can see the expected behavior, but not everyone writes good tests. But that's another, case in which you can just map it out. Like, I want to understand how this thing works, so I'm just going to draw like a map of how all these things are connected until I understand it. I'm going to take this one in the back, and then I'll get to you guys.
So in the example that you showed, it was an issue that was related to an internal library. How does your process for debugging or solving problems change when it's like an external library? Like if it's an issue with React Native that's causing the problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. First, I have a small personal crisis, and then I start to try to be optimistic. Like first I go through like, oh my god, I really don't know what I'm doing, this is terrible. And then I remember I'm a software engineer and I can solve any problem I want to. But I'm really wary when I think that's the case. I'm like, is this really a problem? Is it really the library? Like, what are the odds that it's really the library or the operating system or whatever? Like, I always assume it's me. I always blame myself first. and assume that I have caused this problem before I go saying like, oh, it's this stupid node module that I incorporated into my React Native project or what have you. But when I am at that point, I use tons of print statements. I just try to like figure out what is going on in that library by printing a bunch of stuff.
Do you like read the library?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, usually, like, I'll get a compiler warning or something that hopefully will give me some kind of a stack trace that'll point somewhere. You know, like, I don't tend to make the assumption that it's the library unless, like, my project is telling me that. You know, unless it's saying, like, if the stack trace is pointing to that library, then I'll go in there and I'll try to print from whatever method blew up or what have you. But otherwise, like, the GitHub issues is great. Like, first I would go and I would see, like, is there a repository for this library or this tool that I think is guilty? And, like, you know, there's one for React Native, but I can go to the React Native GitHub repo, and first I can search through the issues and see, like, you know, have other people had this problem? I mean, you can also get there just by searching for whatever warning or issue you're getting. But then, really worst case, I open an issue request and I say like, hey you guys, I'm having this problem. Here's a ton of context. If anyone can help me, I'd really appreciate it. And I've had pretty good success with that. Like worst case, I'm like, you know, creating like, I'm forking that library and then I'm like fixing it and then using my own forked version of that library, which is very depressing and difficult to maintain from there. But you know, does that help?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
So a lot of times, in order to solve a problem, for many people, you have to visualize it. So you mentioned one tool that you use to shoot paper to map
Yeah.
things out. Do you use any other tools that are kind of use a visualization that could be digital or something simple paper?
That's really what I'm relying on, and it hasn't failed me yet. Especially like when I'm working on a part of the project I've never worked on before. I grab my way through it and I find all the relevant pieces. You know, like if I'm like, okay, here's the name of my feature, I type git grep for that feature name and I see all the files that are, you know, and then I just go through them until I can actually figure out like this calls this, which then does that and whatever, what have you. It can be time consuming, but it's totally worth it. Because when I don't do that, then I'm just introducing bugs. Or I'm opening a PR that's embarrassing because someone's like, oh, you missed all this stuff, you know? You have a question?
No, that's good.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Oh, it's probably time for you guys to leave, but wonderful. I don't know why I'm clapping, but great conversation. Thank you so much.
Great
I really
question,
appreciate it. It was fun.